Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Brainsmasher, a love story. This movie was made in 1993, and it was written and directed by Albert Pyun, and it stars Andrew Dice Clay and Teri Hatcher. Even though it says Brion James on the front here, while he is in the movie, he's not one of the main actors. In fact, the other main actor is Yuji Okumoto, and that's, in my opinion, the name that should have been on here. But this is basically a German release of the movie, and I was able to get it because I used the last of an online gift card to buy it, and it came in good condition and everything. But unfortunately, I don't speak German, so there's this nice booklet on the inside here. You open it up and it's got quite a few pages actually, with a lot of information. It's just, unfortunately, I don't speak German, so I don't know what the pages are saying. But the Blu-ray, it has a Blu-ray and a DVD. The Blu-ray is actually compatible with all regions, stateside included, thankfully. But the DVD is not compatible with stateside regions, or with the stateside DVD players or Blu-ray players. But one of the features though on the setup is the audio option, and in the sense that you can have either the English version of the movie or the German dubbed version. And so thankfully I was able to watch the movie in English, and I gotta say it's actually a pretty fun movie, and I would even say it's a good movie, which kind of comes as a surprise because this movie was made by Albert Pyun. And for those of you who don't know, Albert Pyun was a director who started off in the B-movie scene and stayed in the B-movie scene. And while a significant portion of his movies are what I would call bad but interesting to watch, and I say that, I use that description in a sense that you have a bad movie, but there's maybe a scene or two, or maybe there's a good performance in here that offer a glimpse as to what the movie could have been had these elements of competence been expounded on and pursued more. But unfortunately, these moments of competence are just blips on the radar in an otherwise lousy movie. So that's what I mean when I say bad but interesting to watch. And then of course you have some of his other movies which are just plain bad, unfortunately. But he would sometimes turn out movies that were legitimately decent movies, and once in a blue moon, even good. And so when that happened, you had proof that Albert Pyun had some form of talent, and some, he definitely had a creative vision, that was unique. And he had enough, competence and talent to where, when he was firing on all cylinders, and when he was working with a good crew, he would turn out some memorable movies. And so you have movies such as The Sword and the Sorcerer, Cyborg, Dollman, Nemesis, Mean Guns, things like that. And now whether or not you think that those are straight up good movies or not is a different story, but the point is movies like that were unique, and there were movies that you couldn't say were commonplace in cinema. Like they were memorable because of how standalone they were and how unique they were. But usually in cases where the movies were worthwhile, they more often than not fell into the cheesy but cool category. Like, they're too cheesy to be good, but they're too cool to be bad. So I mean, that's where you'd have movies like The Sword and the Sorcerer, Radioactive Dreams, Dollman, Nemesis. But then on the other hand, you'd also have movies like Dangerously Close, or the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Cyborg, or Mean Guns. Those three movies, I would say, were legitimately good movies. Even though they're B movies, they were legitimately good. And so I'm actually surprised and happy to say that Brainsmasher falls into the legitimately good category. It is a B movie to be sure, but it's also a good movie. And so I was very pleasantly surprised, to, find myself legitimately enjoying, this movie. Not in a so bad it's good way, but hey, this is actually fun and a legitimately good movie. And so, in regards to the main actors in the movie, I mean, Andrew Dice Clay, he's a comedian who also acts every now and then. And as far as his comedy goes, I confess I'm not like an expert on him or anything like that, but I have seen some of his stuff, and he usually took on the persona of the Dice Man, which was kind of like a greaser delinquent persona, like leather jacket, or he looked like a thug, in the city or something like that. And his material tended to be very raunchy, very foul. And so depending on your taste in comedy, this guy was filthy but hilarious, or he was just foul and had no merit whatsoever. So me personally, as far as his comedy goes, some of his stuff, every now and then, he would say or do something with his comedy act that, had me cracking up. Now, granted, this was in the, foul humor territory. So, I mean, it was dirty and naughty and all the way through. But, I nonetheless, had found myself, cracking up. But that didn't happen a whole lot. Usually I had to, kind of swim through, a mountain of, perverse humor that I honestly didn't find funny at all to get to these, moments that were funny. And so when you have to, swim through a mountain of, dirt, to, get to, a small diamond, more, I mean, if it's a big diamond, that's one thing. But if it's just like a nugget of a diamond, and then you have to dig through another mountain of dirt to get to the other small diamond, that's not my idea of a good time. And that's kind of how I looked at his comedy, because for every bit that was funny, like sick but funny, there'd be something that was just foul, and when it's nothing but foul humor, it's just not my thing. But but at the same time, I do, understand that there are people who appreciate that kind of humor more. So, kind of a divisive figure as far as comedy goes. But on the other hand, I mean, whether you like his comedy or not, he's actually a legitimately good actor. And the first time I saw him in anything, it was in an episode of MASH. He was a guest star, and this was like the early 80s, and it was just a one-off guest role, but he was actually very good. And if I remember correctly, he played a soldier who was starving himself because I think what happened was he had gone to get something to eat, or he was leaving his friends who were eating, and they end up getting killed. And it was one of the two. It was either him leaving to get something to eat, or he was leaving his friends who were eating. And well, they end up getting killed, and he's the only survivor. And so he's starving himself, or trying to. And so of course Hawkeye has to, I think it was Hawkeye who Alan Alda's character, who had to try and talk him out of it and get through to him. And I saw it when I was younger. Like, that particular episode, I was over at my dad's, and I was just surprised at how good he was. And of course, at the time, I didn't know anything about his Dice Man persona or anything like that. I just thought, man, that was a good actor. And he would go on to have a recurring role in the TV show Crime Story, and I forgot his character's name, but he gained some recognition from that because of his recurring role. And he had a brief part as a bouncer, well, called the Dice Man, in the movie Pretty in Pink, and which is also a good movie. And I remember his part in the movie was pretty cool because he was talking with John Cryer's character, the Duck Man. It's like Dice Man and Duck Man, and basically they were talking about life and relationships, and it's a small part, but I mean, Andrew Dice Clay was good at playing a bouncer who had some harsh but true advice about life and relationships and what have you. So yeah, I mean he definitely was someone that, as far as like acting goes, I mean a lot of people have seen his stuff, or he's been in stuff that has been seen by a lot of people, as far as like regular television at the time, or mainstream movies, and going forward, he kind of gained a new measure of popularity and respect when he was in the Woody Allen movie Blue Jasmine, and I think it was Cate Blanchett who was the main actress in that movie, but Andrew Dice Clay had a supporting part, and a lot of people were actually surprised at how well he did in the part, because it was a serious role. And he was also in the remake of A Star Is Born that had Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga, and if I remember correctly, he plays her father in that movie, and a lot of people were once again surprised at how good of an actor he was. So point being, whether you like his form of comedy or not, he's a talented actor. And so in this movie he was actually pretty good as well, and he more or less plays him a subdued version of the Dice Man, and as a result you have someone who has a natural sense of humor, like wise guy Bronx style humor, but it's not raunchy, like it's actually funny, and so as far as the other important ingredient of the movie, Teri Hatcher, she was drop dead gorgeous in this movie. Like she plays a model, ironically, but she could have been a model, and she plays a model, but she's also a very good actress, and her talent was definitely on hand here, to where she played a model who's basically a ditzy model at first, sort of semi-airheaded persona, or seemingly airheaded persona, but you actually find out that she's a lot smarter than she lets on. So even though she ends up getting in a crazy situation, she's not the gullible idiot that her model appearance would lead people to believe she is, and so it was a pretty cool part that she had to play. And ironically, this movie was made, I think it was shortly before she got the part in Lois and Clark, the TV show from the 90s that had her playing Lois Lane and Dean Cain as Superman. And I believe I remember reading online somewhere that she got the part a few days after she was in this movie, or so she was already on the way to getting her part in Lois and Clark, and that's something that kind of made her a household name. So points of transition, right? But no, she was really good in this movie. Like she's funny, she's competent as an actress, but she's also drop dead gorgeous. And so you have someone who looks good and is good. That's always a good combination. But she actually plays very well off of Andrew Dice Clay and vice versa. And so that's not something that you expect to actually work out beyond being on paper. Because on paper, I mean, you have a movie that's directed by, a B movie director, and then you have a foul-mouthed comedian thrown in as one of the main characters, and then you have, a relatively, new actress at the time, tossed in, and so, you're thinking that this could be a recipe for disaster, right? And then it turns out to actually be a good movie. So this was a nice surprise. But let's go ahead and get into the plot. So the story kicks off with the character of Samantha. Sorry, I have to look at the paper every now and then to get the names right. But Samantha is a model who was played by Teri Hatcher, and she is at a point in her career where, I mean, she's a success, as far as, the modeling industry goes, but not a lot of people, take her seriously as a person. And so basically, she has a boyfriend, or a former boyfriend, who keeps on trying to, buy her love with, things like $10,000 watches and things like that. And she's trying to say, you can't buy me. I'm a person. I mean, yes, I'm modeling, but I'm a person. You can't just, buy me like a commodity. And so she's having to deal with stuff like that and other people that, don't necessarily take her seriously. And she does have some sort of, airheaded characteristics that, pop up every now and then. But usually that's when she's in a situation that she's not wholly familiar with. And so, it's the airheadedness that kind of is relatable, because we all have bubble-headed moments from time to time. So it's not like, stereotypically, blonde airheadedness, if that makes sense. But she ends up getting a package from her sister, who's a botanist named, Cammy, who was played by Deborah van Valkenburgh. And Cammy is her older sister and a lot more, respected as far as, her career goes, because, she's, a world-renowned botanist, and she's got all sorts of awards, all sorts of acclaim and everything, and her family's apparently always singling her out over Samantha. And so Cammy sends her a package one day, and she opens it up, and it's a preserved red flower, and more specifically a red lotus, from Asia. And this particular, red lotus is actually something that's being pursued by this, group of Chinese monks who, believe that the red lotus will give them, ultimate power, power to, make your thoughts reality and basically, rule the world if you want, or destroy it. And so these particular monks are being led by a gentleman named Wu, who's played by Yuji Okumoto. And, and so basically they're holding her older sister, hostage, and basically, it's telling Samantha, you bring the red lotus to us, we'll let your sister go. And so, Samantha, she gets to the rendezvous point, and, Cammy, though, it turns out, is a lot more competent, than the, monks, believed that she was, and is able to get her and Samantha out of there, and she's actually able to put up a fight against them. And so she actually takes the red lotus and tells Samantha to meet her at this church several hours from now, and so that way they can make plans from there in order to outwit the monks. But in the meantime, though, she tells Samantha to split up. And so when the monks realize that Cammy has the red lotus, they actually end up going after Samantha, partially because, she was closer, but also because, as far as they can tell, she's a ditzy model who, is way in over her head, whereas, Cammy is actually capable of defending herself against them, and actually, knows, what they're talking about, and understands their, culture and everything. And so as a result, she would be more of a threat to them. Even though she has the Red Lotus, they're, they realize that she very well could hold them off with her skill. And so they decide to pursue Samantha, in order to, abduct her and, basically hold her hostage, in order to get Cammy to give the Lotus to them. And so they pursue Samantha, and she ends up, running into this nightclub. And as it happens, the bouncer at this nightclub, excuse me, is a guy named Ed Molloy, who's played by Andrew Dice Clay. And his nickname is the Brainsmasher because, anytime someone gets out of line, anytime someone tries to start some trouble, he's able to, take them out in one go and knock them out. And so she actually ends up sneaking past him while he's dealing with a couple other, drunken punks who are trying to cut ahead of the line. And he decides to, once he has them squared away, he goes in after her because, hey, cutting the line's serious business. And so, he gets a hold of her and, tries to say, hey, what the hell are you doing? And she's trying to, tell him, hey, these, Chinese, ninja monks are coming after me and trying to kill me because they're trying to get something my sister has. And so, he's like, yeah, you're all right, whatever, you're on something. And he's thinking that she's on drugs or something like that. But then, he realizes that, no, she's telling the truth when, the monks come in and kill just about everyone in the club and start to pursue, not only Samantha, but him as well. And so, he's in over his head, but nonetheless, tries to protect her and, fight back against the monks, and they actually manage to get ahead of the monks and escape them for a time, but they're able to, track them down rather easily, whether they end up at Ed's apartment or, the home of his parents or a police station. They kind of have a Terminator, level of determination to get the Red Lotus, and through capturing, Samantha, and most likely killing, Ed. But as it happens, though, Ed and Samantha, by being, forced to, work together or, flee together, they actually strike up, something of an odd friendship, because you have this high-end, model that a lot of people don't take seriously, who's actually a little smarter than people, give her credit for. And then you have this, rough-edged bouncer who's got a lot of street smarts. And so two different worlds collide here. And, the two of them end up getting close, all the while trying to, survive these, killer Chinese monks, which, a lot of people keep, mistaking for ninjas. And so, and whenever that happens, they're always having to chime in and say, we're not ninjas, we are monks. And so, the question is, are they going to be able to, successfully rendezvous with, Cammy at the church that she was wanting, to Samantha to meet her at, in order to, make, plans to, keep the Red Lotus away from the monks? Or are the monks going to, capture, Ed and, Samantha before, they're able to make the rendezvous? So that's the basic, plot of the movie right there. But this is actually a very fun movie, and as I said earlier, I was surprised at how much I genuinely enjoyed myself watching the movie, because you have a crazy situation that has this sort of comic book level of energy and fun, and in a sense that you have these Chinese monks that look like something out of a almost like I mean, either a music video or a comic book, in a sense that like they all wear these fedoras and these strange masks, with the exception of when they're taking the masks off to present a more human face. And a good portion of them, from a distance, they're almost garbed like Lamont Cranston, the Shadow, in the sense of their color schemes and what have you. So they're fascinating to look at, and a good amount of the time, while they're more often than not, stalking someone in this ominously large group, sometimes they'll flip through the air just randomly and almost pull a crouching tiger, hidden dragon, and almost like flying almost, but it's more like elegant flipping. But you see them do stuff like that, and it feels like it's bringing an element of fantasy in this urban setting. But and they also turn out to be some dangerous antagonists, because they're able to literally kill everyone at this nightclub, for the most part off screen, although you do see them killing the band by jumping up on stage and either punching or kicking them to death. But on the other hand, they're also able to storm a police station, and catch bullets that are thrown at them. So these guys are dangerous. But at the same time, I mean, Ed, as played by Andrew Dice Clay, turns out to be a halfway decent fighter. So, he has this sort of, I guess you could argue it's plot armor, but it's plot armor that would not be out of place in a comic book. And so, Ed actually does feel like a comic book hero in a roundabout way, in the sense that, he's, someone who's having to defend himself against a fantastical enemy in an otherwise ordinary setting. And so, as played by Andrew Dice Clay, Ed's actually a very likable fellow, and so even though he's got that Bronx personality to him, that's sort of rough around the edges. I mean, he's not a vulgar individual. Like, he's actually laid back and chill for the most part, but at the same time, I mean, he takes his job seriously. And he actually has a pretty good scene where, or as Ed, Andrew, Dice Clay, he has this little, bit where he's, explaining to, Teri Hatcher's character, Samantha, where he's, telling her how, one of the reasons he, got into bouncing was because, back when he was, a kid, he was at a club that he shouldn't have been in, and someone, cut him with a broken bottle. And he said the reason that happened was because there were no bouncers. And so ever since then, he kind of made it his, mission to be the guy to keep the peace in places like that, because that was his world, and he wanted to, live in it, but he also wanted to keep bad people out of it. And so it's like he's this honorable bouncer, which sounds kind of strange, but just the way Andrew Dice Clay plays it, you buy it. I mean, and as strange as this movie is, he's one of the more grounded, characters and elements in the movie, because he's, relatably human and also very likable too. And I liked how he actually had some, good advice for Samantha that kind of aided in her character development and made her a better person, in a sense that, you know, because she's running with him, she's kind of seeing like the, harsh side of reality, in a sense that she's away from her, status of, riches and, privilege and what have you. And so she's having to see, how regular people live. And, she also comes to appreciate that just because, say someone doesn't have a lot of money, that doesn't mean they're, not worthwhile as a person. And case in point, there's this, nice scene where it's a funny scene, but it's also kind of touching in a way. But you see, Ed and Samantha, they, go to his parents' apartment, and you kind of get a snapshot into, what the family life must be like, because he spends a lot of time with them, and they argue, but they also love each other and things like that. And Ed's parents are surprised that he brought a girl over, and they're ecstatic, and because this is a beautiful woman and she seems really nice and everything, but she actually, she's kind of nervous around them. But the way Teri Hatcher plays it, it's just, you see, this, character, basically kind of having her eyes opened, in a sense that, like, you got the idea that, because she was smarter than she let on, and at least as far as the modeling business goes, she had some common sense and everything about, people. But this was like, you get the idea that this is one of the first times that she's been with people in a lower class, and she's basically seeing that there's this family dynamic there, and she actually comes away, appreciating that a whole lot. And so that was actually kind of nice to see. And, a little bit of, character development like that, I didn't expect to see in an Albert Pyun movie. But, you really see Teri Hatcher's character, go from, being, she never stops being the comic relief, because Teri Hatcher just has that comedic knack with her. And fortunately, Albert Pyun, when he wrote the screenplay, he actually, had some good lines for her. So more often than not, her, funny moments work, just as well as, Andrew Dice Clay's funny moments work. And so they really play well off of each other. And as a result, I cared about what happened to these characters. As, goofy as the movie was, I wanted Ed and Samantha to come out okay, and that's definitely a credit to, Andrew Dice Clay's performance as well as Teri Hatcher's performance. And, they had good chemistry with one another, and they made me care about them. And so, they're definitely characters that, if Albert Pyun had made a sequel to this movie and, still had the two of them to work with, I would have been glad to see it. But, another thing that's cool about this movie is Yuji Okumoto as Wu, the leader of the Chinese monks. And, for the most part, a lot of people remember him from Karate Kid 2, which was definitely a good sequel. And he definitely showed that he had what it took to play a villain, because he was very dangerous and scary in that movie. But here, though, make no mistake, he definitely has an air of, an element of, danger to him. And he does show that he's a threat, but at the same time, you get the idea that these monks are strangers in a strange land. And so while, yes, they do plow through, buildings to, go after, Ed and, Samantha, at the same time, there are instances where, Wu, realizes that, hey, it would probably be more conducive to our efforts if we played nice. And so, for example, there is a scene where they actually end up finding out where, Ed's parents are, and, he and the monks go to pay them a visit. But what ends up happening though is, well, while they are searching for Ed and Samantha, Woo's able to, basically convince them that Samantha is in grave danger, and basically, they're, figure, they work with an agency that's trying to, track her down, for her own good and what have you, and so Woo's able to play it off, rather well, at least well enough to convince the parents that, Ed's parents, that he's telling the truth, and as a result, I mean, you see that he has some intelligence there, but he also has an affable persona that, can that he can use to manipulate people. And so, I mean, it was pretty cool to see, Yuji Okumoto play that kind of part. He was also in the movie, another Albert Pyun movie. He was in the movie Mean Guns, and he was pretty good in that too. So I knew he could do comedy, but seeing him playing this killer monk who is having to curb his fellow monks' enthusiasm, and trying to basically play the play nice, was kind of amusing to see. But another another bit that was funny was the fact that Samantha and other people keep calling these monks ninjas, and so the monks and Wu especially are constantly slapping people and saying, "We're not ninjas," and the gag might get old to some people because it happens a lot, and there's like a frequent variation of it. And I mean, there was an instance where this one monk ends up getting killed, but right before he dies, he's like, "We're not ninjas," and then he dies. You have moments like that, but usually it's pretty funny, especially with the way Yuji Okumoto plays it, because you see the frustration mounting. But and there's another bit where it's in the scene where the monks are at the apartment of Ed's parents, trying to track Ed and Samantha down, and the mother was saying that, I mean, she's telling them that they were telling me that they were being chased by Chinese ninjas, and that moment's about to come, but that's when the dad chimes in, and he's like, "These aren't ninjas, they're ninjas are Japanese. These guys are Chinese." And that's when Wu kind of makes friends with Ed's dad, and he's like, "You are a very wise man," and has a lot of respect for him after that, because it's like, finally someone gets it. So you do have moments like that, and you even do have a bit later on in the movie where, I mean, yes, he's determined as hell to beat the crap out of Ed, if not kill him, although he wants to kill Ed, to be sure, because Ed turns out to be a much better fighter than anyone's expecting. Like, he's there, I mean, the fact that he's able to protect Samantha from these guys as long as he was pretty impressive under the circumstances. But considering this comic book like setting, I mean, the plot armor doesn't seem as bad, because I feel like if this movie had been more serious, then the amount of plot armor that Ed's character has would have been a problem. But because of this, comic book atmosphere, I mean, you get the idea that, Ed's just that good of a fighter, but unfortunately, I mean, he is still human at the end of the day. So while he is able to put up a good fight for the most part against these monks, eventually he gets his ass handed to him. And that was actually kind of surprising to see. It kind of made me think of that scene in the first Ninja Turtles movie where you see, Raphael, putting up a good fight against the Foot Clan, but he ends up getting his ass handed to him and knocked into a coma. So that was definitely a moment. I remember in that movie, it was one of those instances where you're kind of like, man, you don't expect to see, that type of, beat down handed to someone, or at least, one of the main characters. And something like that does happen to Ed in the movie. Like, it's not like, it's not an all-out gore fest, because it's not that kind of movie, but it is a rather brutal beatdown, and you're kind of like, oh, because, Ed was, kicking ass and taking names with these guys initially, but then, towards the climax, the Wu stops holding back. But and I also did like, while she didn't get a lot of focus, or as much focus as the other main characters, I did like Deborah Van Valkenburgh as Samantha's sister Cammy, because I mean, she really played an older sister rather well, and there's like that sibling rivalry or sibling dynamic between the two of them, because there's some snarkiness that they have with each other, but at the same time, you buy the fact that she's an older sister who's initially tried to keep her younger sister out of things, but she kind of underestimates the fact that, I mean, and you see that, like, she underestimates Samantha a few times, thinking that because she's a model she's dumb, and Samantha is comes to a point where she's having to call her sister out on it. And so so you have some good sibling banter between the two of them, but you also have Deborah bringing this kind of dried, cynical sense of humor to her part. And for those of you who don't remember the name, she was in the movies The Warriors and Streets of Fire, both directed by Walter Hill. But so it was pretty cool to see her in this, and she was also in Albert Pyun's Mean Guns as well, and she was one of the main characters in that movie. So it was pretty cool to see, her and Yuji Okumoto, like both people who had worked with Albert Pyun before, in this movie, and basically getting to tap into their comedic talents and what have you. But speaking of comedy, one of the funniest parts of the movie is when Ed and Samantha are being interrogated by police at this station, and the detectives that are doing the interrogating, they're like something straight out of one of those over the top black and white movies, where it's like, all right, did you do it? And like, imagine like a fedora wearing detective, with a rumpled white button down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, constantly smoking a cigarette and getting in their faces. And it's a pretty funny scene, because the actors playing the detectives are in fact Tim Thomerson, Brion James, and Charles Rocket, who was one of the members of Saturday Night Live back in the 80s, I believe. But all those guys were in the brief parts they have as the overzealous and over the top detectives are pretty funny, because it's like they're they're just playing up the rabid detectives that you see in over the top movies sometimes. And the way it's done is just, it's pretty funny. And it's like you have their over the top antagonism towards Ed and Samantha, and you have Ed's frustration mounting, and you have Samantha's frustration mounting at the same time. And so it's like they're being interrogated separately, but they're having to, it's like they play off of the actors playing the detectives in different ways, and it's funny in different ways. Like, it's funny in one way with Ed's situation when he's being interrogated by Tim Thomerson and Brion James detectives, and then Teri Hatcher being interrogated by Charles Rocket and this other guy. It's funny in a different way. So like that part was actually had me cracking up. And then, of course, when the whole police station gets attacked by the monks, that's actually a pretty cool action set piece. I mean, funny, but cool at the same time, because the monks are literally, catching bullets and throwing them back at the policemen and killing them. So a bit of a nod to Terminator there as well. And also, another thing I liked about this movie was the soundtrack. Um, like the instrumental score by uh, for the most part by Tony Ripperardi, who has worked with Albert Pyun rather frequently. He turns in another good score, and there's also some good songs that are thrown into this movie. I forgot what the names are, but like there's a song that plays when Ed and Samantha briefly split because they have a falling out, and you see them both walking separately in different directions, and the song kind of goes along with the feelings that they've developed for one another, but they're like reluctant to admit it and what have you. And so and it's all set to like when Samantha's going to the rendezvous point to the church by herself, and it's a really good use of music in that particular scene. So it's like you see two dejected people who are reluctant to admit that they need each other, that kind of thing. And it's just a nice piece of music, and it worked for the scene. But also some of the cinematography was actually pretty good too. It was by a guy named George Mooradian, and I mean, a couple of scenes that stood out to me were there was one of the scenes where the Chinese monks are going from rooftop to rooftop in order to get to Ed's building, or Ed's apartment building, and it's like the camera is like looking up at the top of the building, and you see some of the monks walking along the edges of the roof, and there's some light that's shining from somewhere nearby, and they're almost backlit, and you also see some water kind of blowing by as well, like droplets of water all from a distance, or maybe it's just like dust motes or something. But anyway, it's a pretty cool shot though, when you see them sneaking along the rooftop at night like that, and what looks like water droplets blowing against them from a distance. It's kind of like a very surreal shot, and I liked bits like that. And also the scene where Samantha is going to the church to meet her sister. That was a moment where that song was kicking in and it was winding down, but there was like some good instrumentals that sort of added to the ambiance of the church, because in terms of cinematography they made the church look very ornate, and also almost holy. I mean, I know a church is supposed to look holy, but it actually looked like a place where something spiritual might be going down, just like from the way it's lit and everything, and how the camera was being used for the scene and everything. So it was a good little visual moment, I thought. And it's pretty cool when you have quality camera work in a low budget movie like something like this. But I will say that, I mean, there are some things that I guess you could say are problems or cons in the movie. Of course, I mean, you have the aforementioned plot armor that Ed ends up having, which, I mean, in my opinion, wasn't that much of a problem because of the nature of the movie, this comic book feel that the movie has. But some people might be, sort of like, well, wait a minute, if these, Chinese, monks can, tear through a police station and, catch bullets and flick them back at you, I mean, why are they having such a hard time, out fighting Ed when he's just a Bronx bouncer, But, I mean, at the same time, because, Andrew Dice Clay does such a good job of playing, Ed, and because, of the comic book feel of the movie, the fact that he's able to, outfight a lot of these guys, for the most part, it doesn't really come across as too much of a problem, at least for me. But some people might, be more along the lines of, well, hey, this Ed shouldn't be handling these guys as easily as he is. And to be fair, towards the end of the movie, he does, have the tables turned on him. But I can see where some people would be like, yeah, that's a problem. But I will say, though, while he does, teach Samantha how to fight, sort of, like he gives her a few moves on the fly, and she does get to use them. I did think that, she kind of became, a little too good at fighting at times. Like, she uses the moves that he taught her exclusively, which is, basically, hit him in the balls and then hit him in the jaw and knock him out, right? But I do think that, she, like, there's a scene or two where she takes someone out like that, and it's like, okay, I mean, maybe taking one guy out like that, I could see, but multiple guys, yeah, you're kind of pushing credibility there. But at the same time, I mean, because it doesn't happen a whole lot, I mean, it's not that much of a problem. But at the same time, there's a moment where you're kind of like, yeah, nah, that wouldn't work. But at the same time, because Teri Hatcher does such a good job playing her, I mean, it's not that much of a problem. But I mean, that little bit of, straining credibility is there because of that. But mainly because, I mean, Ed's already been established as a pretty skilled fighter, whereas, Samantha is a model who's literally on the run for her life and does not know how to fight, and she kind of becomes a, somewhat competent fighter overnight. You're like, no, that wouldn't happen like that. But I guess the other thing is, when it comes to the Red Lotus itself, I mean, you do have, the character of Cammy, Samantha, the older sister, the botanist, explained to Samantha, just what could happen if someone like Wu gets a hold of it. But in my opinion, like, the explanation's a little too brief. Like, it's a little too vague as to, exactly, what could happen. I mean, other than, if someone has the Red Lotus and they devour it, and they can have the power to make their thoughts reality or something like that. I mean, like, we know that Wu and his order of monks want the Red Lotus, but we don't really know why they do. We just know that they do want it. And so, Wu, I mean, as fun of a villain as he is, I mean, he does sort of become a mustache-twirling villain at the climax, where the villain's like, ha ha ha, I've got the such and such, that kind of thing. And, and we know that, I mean, he wants to become a god or something, but we don't really know why he wants to become a god. But so I wish that there'd been a little more exposition as far as, his exact desires, I mean, other than the vague notion of him being a god, because that's been done a million times already. But and also, I just think that because it's the object of so many people's attention, the Red Lotus doesn't really seem to have that much importance in the movie. I mean, it's here and there, and it's talked about for a little bit, but I didn't really care about the Red Lotus, and in fact, it was kind of like there were times where I just kind of forgot about it altogether, um, because I was, more, focused on, the characters of, Ed and Samantha, because the actors playing them did such a good job, right? And so every now and then the Red Lotus would come up and be like, oh yeah, that thing, that kind of thing. So, excuse me, sorry. So I guess another thing is, um, there, semi spoiler, there is a point at the climax where Ed's able to literally punch, a character's face in. Okay, now it's like it's not over the top R-rated, blood and gore or anything like that, but this person's face is like literally caved in with one hit, and so you're thinking, if he had that much power, this whole time, why didn't he, use it, against the, these monks that are, trying to kill him? And so, and it's a pretty cool moment, but it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, I mean, I can buy the fact, I mean, because of the whole comic book atmosphere, I can buy the fact that he's able to hold his own against some of the monks for a time, but when he's suddenly able to do that against one of them, it's kind of like, okay, if you're going to have him do something like that, I mean, the comic book atmosphere can carry you only so far. So if you're not going to have some kind of explanation as to why he was able and how he was able to do that, I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so, as cool as the effect is for a low budget, I should say, it you're kind of like, but if he could do that, why didn't he do that against all these guys, So it's one of those instances where it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I know you're going to say, well, does anything make sense in this kind of movie? But the movie, for the most part, did have its own logic. And so when that happened, you're just kind of like, are they going to explain how he's able to do that or why he was able to do that? And I mean, heck, Cammy's character could have had some sort of vague, mystical explanation. Like maybe whoever's, guarding, the guardian of the flower receives some sort of, some sort of blessing that's passed on to whoever's protecting the guardian of the flower. I don't know, but just a little something that could have explained why this guy was able to literally cave in a person's face with one blow all of a sudden. But I mean, yeah, I know. Just that would have cleared some stuff up, and it would have kind of gone along with the whole comic book atmosphere. I mean, it would have been a cliche explanation, but I mean, like, the maybe the Red Lotus had some power that rubbed off on the protector of the person that was guarding it or something like that. I mean, cliche, cheesy, but at least it would have been an explanation. But yeah, so I guess another thing is, you have to have an appreciation for B movies to, like this movie, I think. Just kind of know going in that it's a comic book, styled, action, semi-fantasy movie, in a sense that these monks are able to do all these crazy things, but you have these two protagonists sort of, grounded in reality. And I mean, so it's, you check your brain at the door, but in doing so, I think, most people who do so will enjoy this movie. So I'm going to go ahead and give Brainsmasher, a love story, 4 out of 5 stars. So this was, surprise of surprises, a good movie from Albert Pyun. And also, surprise of surprises, Andrew Dice Clay and Teri Hatcher play very well off of each other. So as far as anything in the way of special features, apparently there are supposed to be some special features on the Blu-ray, like maybe some artwork or something like that, if I understood the German right. But whenever I tried to access the special features, it would just put me right back at the menu. So I don't know if that's like a regional thing, or I just got a strange copy, Blu-ray copy. But I can't complain too badly because one, I was able to watch the movie and also able to watch it in English, and so able to enjoy it, and it was a good movie. And two, it wasn't my own money, so I can't complain too badly about that. But just be aware, if you try to get this particular version of the movie, this German edition, it might not work on the Blu-ray. Even though you can watch the movie on a stateside Blu-ray player, the special features might not work. So just know that going in. But other than that, though, I mean, yeah, Brainsmasher, good movie, 4 out of 5 stars. And I have to echo the sentiments of some other reviewers of this movie that it's a bummer that for the most part, the Albert Pyun movies that get the special features are the ones that aren't so good. Like there's even a movie he made in the 90s called Ticker, which was a pretty bad movie, and that one had an audio commentary, right? But then you have movies like Dangerously Close that just have a theatrical trailer, right? And but this one, yeah, I guess mainly because I can't really get the special features to work. Like I said, don't know if that's a regional thing or what, but it'd be cool if, this movie, because of, you look at this and everything, it's like a book almost, and it clearly has a fan base, like in Europe. And so you think that with that in mind, they would have, ponied up the, cash and moolah to, give us a good stateside release of this movie with some good bonus features, because they finally did so with Sword and the Sorcerer, Cyborg, and Nemesis. And I heard they not that long ago finally put Mean Guns out on Blu-ray too with some good bonus features. And so it's like they're finally starting to show Albert Pyun some respect as far as releasing his movies. And it's just unfortunate that they started doing so either when he was dying or when he'd already died. And so it would have been nice to have this movie have such treatment as well. So, but yeah, Brainsmasher, 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good, fun movie. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.